different than I'm going to say. You might as well.
Okay.
Isn't that what they say, Rabbi? That they say that's
Yes.
that is the ultimate proof that was given. The Torah was given by God because they all heard him.
Yes.
But how do we know that?
Okay, so I think that there's two parts of the question, and I'll try to separate them for everyone. I think your question was, number one, how do you know that Moses is the greatest prophet? That was question number one. And question number two, how do we know that he was even a prophet?
No, I get that.
Okay, so when we say that Moses is the greatest prophet, let's first source that. We could source it in the Talmud in Yevamos, 69a or b, 69 somewhere, brought down in the Ramban in chapter 17, verse 1 of Genesis. Moshe Rabbeinu nesnave ba'aspaklaria me'ira. Moses, all prophets, Moshe Rabbeinu nesnave ba'aspaklaria me'ira. All the prophets gave prophecy in unclear fashion, as opposed to Moses gave clear fashion. We know face to face he spoke to God. That's source number one. Source number two, you'll find all the prophets, Bekoyamar, so said God, right? As opposed to Moses gave a prophecy of Zeh Hadavar, this is the thing. So, two sources where we see that the nature of Moses' prophecy was different than the nature of the prophecies of the other prophets. Maimonides, in his famed 13 Principles of Faith, that he writes in the introduction to the last chapter of Sanhedrin, in the Pirush Mishnayos, in the commentary of the Mishnah, he writes 13 Principles of Faith. One of the principles is to believe that Moses is the father of all prophets, which is a seemingly strange statement. What does it mean, father of all prophets? He fathered them? What about the ones who came before him? What about Abraham? What does it mean that Moses is the father of all prophets? So we see Moses is a higher level. That's question number one that you had. Question number two is, how do we know that Moses? Well, how do we know that Moses?
How do we know that the Israelites or the Jews that actually heard?
Okay, so that is because it says in the Torah.
It says in the Torah.
How do we know that that's true? Is what it says.
Well, so is the question specifically, how do we know that any part of the Torah is true, or how do we know that? Or specifically that part?
The greatest thing, according to what I know, is that we were there and we heard.
Yes.
How do we know that?
Well, how?
Because it says in the Torah.
Yes.
That's the only.
It says in the Torah, it's been believed for the Jews for millennia. How do we know that Abraham Lincoln existed? No one ever saw him. Well, it's the kind of thing where we have a documentation of 2 million people who saw an unbelievable event, and they passed it to their children, and it's impossible to falsify. And I think this demonstrates the difference between the verification of our religion and the verification of other religions.
Yeah,
our religion started off with a national prophecy. And what was the prophecy? Where the Jews saw, well, they heard the first two of the Ten Commandments from God. They had experienced national prophecy. But also, they heard that God called up Moses. And he said, Moshe alei hahar, Moshe, come up to the mountain. Right? And all the Jews saw it. And hence, when Moshe comes back and says, here are the laws, here are the rules, here are the restrictions, here is that if you can't collect sticks, twigs on Shabbos, and if you do collect twigs on Shabbos, you're going to be killed. And they didn't say, hey, this guy's a lunatic. They said, oh, Moses is a prophet. He must be. We better accept what he says. Remember, the Torah is lots of laws and lots of rules. If the Jews thought that Moses was a charlatan, they wouldn't have accepted it. The Jews obviously believed it, and that's why we know the Jews have across history have accepted it without any doubt. But I think specifically this point, these two questions which you asked, the answer to them is interrelated. When we see a prophet, when someone says to us, when I wake up tomorrow morning, I call everyone and say, I'm a prophet, believe in me, I spoke to God, God spoke to me. What do you ask me? What's the question you ask me?
How do you know? How do you know?
Oh, how do I know? How do you know? You know. But how do I know you're not lying to me?
Yeah, that's it.
That's the question. And when Joseph Smith comes to us in New York and he says to us, hey, the angel showed me the golden tablets, and what do we say? How do you know? Maybe you're lying. Oh, and it was written in Reformed Egyptian, and here's the translation, Book of Mormon. How do we know you're not lying? And when Muhammad comes to us in Mecca, Medina, in the year of 600, and says to us, "Oh, I'm a prophet. I'm actually the last prophet of Allah. Muhammad Rasul Allah. We all know that. Hey, believe me, or else I'm going to slaughter you." What do we say to him? Please don't slaughter us, but how do we know you're not lying? When Paul comes to us and says, "Oh, I met Jesus on the way to Damascus," what do we ask him? How do we know you're not lying? It's his word versus my word. It's his word versus Rabbi Wolbe's word. It's his word versus Susan. Everyone could say, just as well as Muhammad can, or just dismiss it, I had a prophecy. It's not verified. And you know what? If Abraham came to us, if we lived in the time of Abraham, and Abraham says to us, "I spoke to God," what do we say to Abraham?
Prove it.
How do we know you're not lying? Right? Moses, we all experienced. Everyone who was there experienced God calling Moses Alei Alahar. Moses is what's called a verified prophet. Right? I'm a verified non-prophet.
Torch is a verified.
Everyone heard, and there's solicitation to be coming. The Torah clearly says, and it's been clearly accepted for over the years, that all the Jews saw Moshe being called up to the mountain, and Moshe going up to the mountain, coming back 40 days later with the Torah. The Jews were not worshiping the golden calf at the time where Moses was getting the Torah. That's a mistake, popularized by 1956 movie by the title Ten Commandments. It's actually not true. If you read the Torah, look at the Torah in the middle of Exodus and towards the beginning of Deuteronomy, where it talks twice, it says over the story of how the Jews got the Torah or the Mount Sinai experience. It clearly says that everyone saw, everyone experienced. Sorry for scaring you. Everyone saw and everyone experienced the same thing. Moses is a verified prophet. Okay, that's how we know that Moses is a prophet. It's a historical fact that's beyond repute, incontrovertible, totally true, and impossible to falsify. It's not possible to falsify. Now, so let me finish this point. Because Moses is a verified prophet, therefore he's the father of all prophets. When Abraham comes to us and says, "I'm a prophet," we say, how do we know? But when Moses comes to us and tells us Abraham is a prophet,
Then we believe.
he's the father of all prophets. Because Moses is a verified prophet, he can verify other prophets. All the other prophets that exist, we only believe that they exist because Moses told us they exist. Hence, the answer to both your questions, Dave.
Thanks.
Well, can I ask another question?
Oh, is it the same point? Well, anyone has any questions on that point? Yes.
My,
Oh, you go.
my question is, when Moses got the 10 Commandments, they were on
Moses
tablets.
didn't get the Ten Commandments.
He did?
No.
So he was shown
No.
wrong.
No. When the Jews were by Sinai, the entire Jews experienced, they heard it. Well, they actually saw it and heard it. But they had a prophetic revelation of the Ten Commandments. 40 days later, Moses comes back with tablets that have the Ten Commandments etched in them. But they didn't get it from the tablet. They got it. They had the experience where they heard the Ten Commandments, and then they heard Moshe Alei Alahar.
That was the souvenir.
But afterwards he came back with the physical tablets.
So then, how were the 613 commandments conveyed? That's a lot of commandments.
Well, it was
Somebody didn't
Well,
memorize it.
Moses had prophecy. God told him there's 613 or general categories of rules you have to follow, and he taught them to Moses.
So
And then
he
Moses taught it to Aaron. Then Moses taught it to Aaron and Joshua. And then Moses taught it to Aaron, Joshua, and all the leaders. And then Moses taught it to Aaron, Joshua, all the leaders, and all the Jewish people. And they learned with groups, the group study, you ask your teacher, you don't understand. And that's why when Jethro comes to the Jewish people and he sees, whoa, everyone's going to ask Moses questions, right? Last week's parsha. He says they break it up into different schools, and they have it. They had a very dynamic. Remember, they're by Mount Sinai for how long? How long were they by Mount Sinai for?
What's your question?
How long were the Jews by Mount Sinai?
40 years?
40 years? No, not quite. But they were there for almost a year, a shade less than a year. They were there for a long, long time. What did they do there? They studied. Did they have iPads? No. Did they watch television? No. Did they listen to the radio? No. What did they do? They studied Torah. That's what they did. That's what they did. So yeah, it was
When all else fails.
when all else fails. That's what they did. They studied Torah. So that's how they learned the laws. Yes. Good question?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, but we have seen the grave of Abraham, but where is the grave of Moses? So, we have proof that Abraham is, We need proof about Moses.
Well, have you seen the grave of Genghis Khan, or better yet, have you seen the grave of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? Have you seen the grave? Yeah. Has anyone here ever seen the grave of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? Does anybody know anybody who's ever seen the grave of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? Huh? Naturally, it is nowhere because Mozart was buried as a common person as a pauper, and those graves were dug up after 10 years. Nobody knows where he is buried. So does that mean he didn't exist?
No.
Well, how do we know it didn't exist?
Well, we have all the music.
Well, we have his documents. How do you know Moses didn't exist? We have his documents. And we have much more than that. We have the testimony of the millions of people who saw him, who witnessed it.
There's another aspect here.
Seeing a graveyard doesn't mean anything. And it says in the Torah, it says that no man will know where Moses is buried.
There's another aspect, is that because Moses wrote the Torah himself by the word of God and gave it to the people, all right? Before he passed away, the last thing he did was he wrote 13 Torah scrolls. One which went into the tabernacle, which was in the center of the camping of the Jews, of the encampments, and each one of the 12 tribes got a copy of the Torah. Right? Now, in that Torah, and we've said this here before, imagine I give you a Torah today, and I say, I am your God. Okay, no, not Hashem. Me, I'm your God. Okay? Why? Because I've shown you great miracles, and I've fed you through the Sahara Desert. And then, when we came to Galveston, to the port of Galveston, you remember all the miracles that we saw with all the elephants were jumping? You don't remember? Right? And I write it down, right? Tell this to your children forever and ever, and don't forget that on the 26th of September you make a Seder, right? To remember this. What are you going to do with this book when I give it to you? There's a trash can right at the corner, right? Right at the way out, right? You're going to take it, and you're going to politely just throw it out, right? Because that's not true. None of this ever happened. But if I give you a document that tells you, do you remember the 10 plagues? Do you remember the splitting of the sea? You remember Moses going up the mountain? You remember what you heard at the mountain? And so on and so forth. And you experienced it. You know everything is true. That's the only way for something, if it's a mass revelation, which is the lock, which takes that public revelation and locks it in, because now we have a document that proves it. I can't say that the entire Houston was there, because the entire Houston wasn't there. It was only us. Right? So that when you have that document that's publicly distributed, that's why it's so important that it was a national revelation. It wasn't just as an individual in Damascus or in Mecca. Right?
And think about it, especially if this is compounded. Rabbi Wolbe's point is compounded by the fact that this document has lots of rules. Would you accept a document with tons of rules that claim to be divine when you know the guy is a charlatan? Of course not. Only if you saw Moses and you knew these things were true. And Moses tells them, don't forget what you saw. It says in the Torah tons of times, you saw it, you experienced it. You wouldn't accept that document to be true and adhere to it and live your life in accordance with it if you didn't know it was verified.
Okay, so, Moses, you guys agree that Moses was a prophet of prophets, right?
Yeah, well, that was the original point. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So he's the original, right? So why, now we have, he wrote this. He brought down the, he was the one that God gave to bring down the Torah, right, or the inscribed. So why didn't he get to go to Israel?
Well, the Torah says that. Well, what the Torah says. The Torah says that.
I mean, if he was the most famous prophet, he should have been the first one in Israel.
Yes.
To me, right?
I'll tell you what the Torah says. The Torah says is that the Torah is actually very critical of Moses, which is another good point, important point. The Torah, many, many, many times, more than any one person in the Torah, Moses is criticized more than anyone else. And that's another one of the psychological proofs that it couldn't have been this guy Moses trying to do a self-aggrandization because he wouldn't write such negative things about himself. But one of the things that it says in Riva, where is that? I think it's somewhere in the middle of Numbers. It says that when Moses hit the rock, yeah, Moses hit the rock. What did God say? Moses hit the rock. Moses says, "Yan lo yamantim bi," because you didn't believe in me, you're not going to Israel. It says that Moses was punished because of this mistake, and he says, "You don't believe in God, you don't go into Israel." Now the Talmud says that Moses was devastated by this, and he says, "Make me into a bird so I can fly over and just see Israel." And he prayed 515 times to go back into Israel. V'eschana, beginning of Deuteronomy, he says over the story, and he says that I prayed to God, and God said, "Don't pray anymore." And that's what it says. It says that Moses made a mistake, and therefore he was punished by not being allowed to go into Israel. In the end of Deuteronomy, it says he goes onto that mountain, he overlooks Israel. He's able to see it, but he can't go in. If you look a little bit at the more mystical words, it says that had Moses gone into Israel, Moses would have been the Messiah, and the world would have come to its completion. It means the idea of the most spiritual person being in the most spiritual place would have been enough to push humanity over the top. That's the more spiritual. But what the Torah tells us is that he made a mistake, obviously in his degree, and therefore he was punished. That's why he wasn't allowed to go into Israel.
That's rough. It's really hard to accept
Susan,
that because
it's a really rough life we have here.
That guy did so much, and he really, it really wasn't fair. But what you're talking about, the last thing that you were talking about, you just mentioned, is that sort of connected with the idea of idolatry? That he would have been, if he'd been allowed to go there,
No.
The people would have looked at him like,
No, Susan. What I said is like this. I said 2 points. I said, number one, why was he not allowed to?
Oh, yeah, I understand.
And that was because he was punished. And I mentioned that the mystical sources say that had he, not in a negative way, but actually a very positive thing, but had he been allowed to go in, he would have been the Mashiach, and he would have been a very positive thing. It wasn't saying a negative thing. It wasn't two reasons. It was one, a reason, what the Torah says, and two, there's a little bit of the mystical flavor to explain what would have happened. So, yes. That, yeah, you know what I'm saying?
I do.
Yes, it's two separate points. The reason is number one, and two is that what would the circumstances have been had Moses gone into Israel? Is this in the same point? New point. Does anyone has any further questions on the previous point?
The last plague where the Egyptians' firstborn son is going to be killed.
Yes.
How can that be possible? God does that because He writes in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not kill," and then He kills the Egyptian boy.
I'm saying my grandfather's dead also, right?
It doesn't make sense.
What? My grandfather's dead? Well, remember, the Ten Commandments are rules for us, right? God has the ultimate strings, and anyone who dies, because God killed him. Anyone who has died in history has died because God killed him. Okay? God enabled his soul and body to be separated. So just like my grandfather died, and just like lots and lots and lots of people in history, and just like we will all die, all of us in this room, the basic condition of humanity, that all people die from it, that's the reality.
But not die. They were killed, murdered.
They're
That
not-
was the
they were-
curse, right?
Jewish.
That's between
So-
people. It's not between
Huh?
God and people.
Yes. The Ten Commandments say that there's rules for us to follow. We can't try to figure out why did God do things. We don't understand. Like, we can't understand that we don't have the intellectual capacity to understand why God did things. We have a very narrow view of the world. We see God doing something. We don't know why, what happened before and what happened afterwards. We have a thin slice of time that we look at. We don't know what the neshama is all about, what a person's neshama is about. These are things that we don't know. But God, when He killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, was certainly not in conflict with the Ten Commandments. And just like He's not in conflict with the Ten Commandments when He kills any one of us, or any one of any people. Like what? There's 1 million people every day who die. People die all the time, and it's not God going against His own word.
The Talmud says that a Jewish court, that would kill once every 7